We're on page 281 in the Kuzari. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has an unusual way of classifying the mitzvot, as I had mentioned last time. And up until now, he is describing a saintly person who observes mitzvahs that are carefully prescribed by Hashem in the Torah, but really are behaviors that we wouldn't normally intuit on our own because of all of the specifics that seem to go beyond normal human rationality. So he gave us a number of examples of this, and now he tells us in paragraph 8, in addition to all of the obligatory commandments, the saintly person is also very careful to regularly bring voluntary burnt offerings and peace offerings, and to fulfill his obligations when he voluntarily accepts upon himself to be a Nazir. And that essentially is saying is that when it comes to divine commandments, where God says, this is how I would like you to serve me, there is an opportunity for a person to go above and beyond the letter of the law, and that's a sign of piety, to sort of volunteer additional acts, which once again are of the divine genre, which means I don't fully grasp how this is beneficial, but if Hashem says that this is a good thing, then I want to voluntarily do more of that kind of thing. So the example that he gives is offering additional karbanos. And another example is to make himself or herself into a Nazir, to a Nazirite. A Nazirite has to let their hair grow long, they abstain from wine, they abstain from coming in contact with ritual impurity, with tumah. So those are things that a person go above and beyond the letter of the law. I mean, we have these kinds of practices today. There are many kinds of mitzvahs that fall into this category, where there are certain kinds of Jews who resonate naturally with this kind of supernatural kind of mitzvah performance and go above and beyond what is required of them. So can you think of some examples of that kind of mitzvah performance today, where a person might say to herself or himself, I want to do more of that kind of thing, even though there's no sort of intellectual connection to it, but I feel spiritual when I do those things. Some examples that you can think of today? Yeah.
I remember when we were living in Israel in our yeshuv, there were men that walked with tefillin the entire day.
All right, a good example. There's only a requirement to wear tefillin during prayer nowadays, but in the times of the Talmud, people used to wear tefillin all the entire day. Requires greater intensity of thought. Some men wear 2 pairs of tefillin, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, right? So that would be an additional. And again, these are things that intellectually, I don't necessarily feel how intellectually this is contributing more to my service to the Creator, but I believe that there's something metaphysical within this action itself that actually creates a spiritual bond that is totally invisible. Yes, Shireen?
People who stand the whole of Yom Kippur.
People who stand all of Yom Kippur. There. Okay, again, it's not intellectually necessarily satisfying, but it's honorific, and I feel I'm doing more. Yeah.
To light Shabbat candles a few minutes before the time.
To accept Shabbos a little bit earlier, to go above and beyond the letter of the law. All of these are great examples. Having a group of people get together every week or whatever it is to say Tehillim. Again, we've talked about this idea that there are certain aspects of prayer that are intellectually satisfying, and certain aspects of prayer which are metaphysical in nature. Saying Tehillim certainly without understanding the words has spiritual value to the adherent, not because I'm relating to the words that David HaMelech is saying, but rather because I feel that there's an intrinsic holiness, something spiritual about these words, that if I say them, even without understanding them, I feel I'm making some kind of connection. So that's the genre of divine law that he's given us several examples of. And then he says in paragraph 9, he says, the above and all similar practices fall under the category of divine laws, And most of them require the participation of a Kohen to make them complete. So why do you think he adds that little tidbit of information? That in many times when you want to get involved in this kind of mitzvah, you need the help of a Kohen. Now, Kohen today, we don't associate, in temple times, you'd have a Kohen helping you bring a korban. Today, who is the Kohen? The rabbi. And in Hasidic circles, it's the Rebbe, right? It is someone who we associate with Kedusha that can help bring us up metaphysically to a higher level. It is all part of the same idea that we believe in this metaphysical reality that I can't see, that I can't rationalize, but I believe is as real as anything else that I can understand in the physical world. And that's part of what the Torah tells us is real. And that's why many times I may not be able to bridge a certain gap, a spiritual gap that exists between my objective and where I am presently. And I have to bridge the gap with the help of someone who is identified as a holy person within the community. But again, it's because we are assigning objective reality to these metaphysical phenomena. That's all that's included in the divine mitzvahs. Okay? And that's why I think he talks about a Kohen in the context of these mitzvahs. Okay. Now we go what he calls the civil laws. HaTorot HaMinhagiyot, which means, minhagiyot literally means how we conduct ourselves within society. The Torah has a prescribed protocol about how we conduct ourselves in civics, the way we live with our fellow human being. So that includes don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, honoring your father and mother, love your neighbor as yourself, love the convert, do not deny falsely or lie to your fellow man. They also include distancing oneself from any type of lending with interest, being honest with weights and measures, leaving gifts for the poor in the field, such as leaving the stalks that have accidentally fallen to the ground, leaving the small vines with few grapes, leaving the corner of the tree in the field, and the like. Leket, olalos, peah, shechicha. Many of you may be familiar with those terms. Those are halachos that have to do with agriculture. When you're farming, you have to leave a certain amount of a percentage of your field for the poor. This is not tithing in the sense of giving it to a holy person like we learned before, but rather it is civics. It is mitzvah performance that has to do with making sure that everyone around me, not just myself, but all my entire community, is treated properly. So it includes members of my family, my parents. It includes members outside of my family, the poor in my community. All of these are under the category of civil law or civics. Yeah.
Are we supposed to also give charity to non-Jewish things? Like now, Christmas time, they're collecting Salvation Army. Are we obligated in any way to do that?
The Shulchan Aruch says that a Jew is obligated to contribute a portion of his tithing, of his tzedakah money, to non-Jewish causes. Obligated to non-Jewish causes. And it's because of what the Rambam calls darchei shalom. It is because we are obligated to maintain peaceful relations with non-Jews in society, and therefore we have to give a certain percentage of our charity to non-Jews to make sure, and that doesn't just include charity. The Rambam says included in this obligation is the mitzvah to visit the sick who are non-Jewish. It includes the obligation to bury the dead who are non-Jewish and can't afford their own burial. We seem to have forgotten this over centuries of religious persecution and have distanced ourselves excessively from the Gentile world. But this is actually contained in Shulchan Aruch. There is, according to some authorities, a halachic problem involved in making donations specifically before Christmas, or Krachtzmas, as we say in Yiddish, right? And the halachic difficulty is because The Gemara in Avodah Zarah, the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah says you're not allowed to engage in commercial trade or do favors for a heathen immediately before his holiday, lest he use your favor as a means of praising his getchka, his idolatry. I believe that there are several poskim today who would be stringent in that matter, and therefore if there is a specific Christmas campaign, they would discourage you from donating to that. But I believe that there are many poskim today who would say that it's perfectly fine because Christmas has lost most of its pagan original flavor, and it's just a time to help people out, just like Thanksgiving, right? It's a time to have dinner with family. And do you know how much domestic violence took place over Thanksgiving? Like, I was listening to an American radio station, and invariably every Thanksgiving people get murdered because families get into fights. This is a foreign concept to you Canadians, but for us Americans who grew up with this, it's like every Thanksgiving and every Christmas you listen to the news the day after Thanksgiving, the day after Christmas, how many fatalities were there over Thanksgiving and Christmas due to families getting into fights. I want the turkey thigh, you think you can't have it, and they get into fights, and you looked at my wife the wrong way, and then they get into a big fight, right? Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. But so to answer your question, Linda, there is an obligation in halacha to give to non-Jewish charities, to support non-Jewish causes. It doesn't have to be a large percentage, but it is a percentage nonetheless. The question, of course, in halacha is whether it's appropriate to specifically donate to a Christmas campaign. That the jury is out. There's a difference of opinion among the poskim. Okay, and you have the latitude to make that decision on your own. Okay. So anyway, so let's go on to the next paragraph. The rational laws. Now, what he means by rational laws, I believe, at least in the context in which he describes them, has to do with how a person intellectually relates to God. It's not having to do with civil law, like the mishpatim that he just quoted a moment ago, but rather has to do with intellectual exercises on a philosophical level. How I think about God, how I relate to God on an intellectual level. Remember, we saw that there's a way to relate to God on a non-intellectual level by doing the divine laws. But now let's see how I relate to God on a rational level, which philosophers have also embraced, include, I am the Lord your God, so I have to have an intellectual understanding of Hashem. You shall not have any other gods before me. I have to repudiate a belief in any other deities other than Hashem. You may not take the name of Hashem in vain. The Torah also includes principles that philosophers do not necessarily accept, such as that Hashem knows the innermost thoughts of people, and certainly their deeds and their conversations, and that he rewards and punishes man for them, and that Hashem's eyes rove throughout the entire world. I'm going to get to this in just a second. But before I do, I just wanted to point out, just concluding our discussion of the laws of civics, we just had in the Daf Yomi today, we're finishing Maseches Makos tomorrow, and in the Daf Yomi, we learned about the last Mishnah in Masechet Makot, which quotes Rabbi Hanani ben Akashya, one of the most oft-quoted sentences from Mishnah, because after every time we learn on a daily basis, the daily halacha finishes with Rabbi Hanani ben Akashya. The daily study between Mincha and Marav finishes with Rabbi Hanani ben Akashya. What does Rabbi Hanani ben Akashya say? Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakot et Yisrael. That Hashem wanted to give merit to the Jewish people, lefichach hirba lahem Torah u'mitzvos, and therefore he increased the amount of Torah and mitzvot. Shenemar Hashem chafetz l'man tzidko yagdil Torah v'yadir. As it says, Hashem desires for the righteousness of his people, and therefore he shall increase Torah and fortify it. Now, what does this mean? So the simple context of that Mishnah, if you look in the context of where it appears and what it comes right after, is that there are many mitzvot in the Torah that had they not been commanded, I would have known to do them anyway. And we don't need a divine source to know that it is wrong to murder, that it is wrong to steal, that it is wrong to commit adultery. Those are human, intuitively human, that we know every society has those laws in place. Why then did Hashem create these mitzvot in the Torah when we would have intuited them on our own? The answer is because Hashem wants to give us added merit. The Mishnah essentially states that if a person refrains from murder, consciously knowing that I'm fulfilling a divine commandment from refraining from murder, I get rewarded by Hashem for fulfilling a mitzvah. If I refrain from stealing, the same thing. Even if I refrain from things that I normally would find repulsive, I still get rewarded for the performance of that mitzvah, from refraining from doing something. The example that the Mishnah gives, if I refrain from drinking blood, the Torah says that you're not allowed to consume blood, and that's why we salt and roast our meat in order to kosher it. So the Mishnah says, now of course, who would want to eat blood? Blood is a repulsive product of an animal. You wouldn't want to eat it anyway. You wouldn't want to ingest blood of an animal, unless maybe you're British and you like blood pie, or isn't that what they have? Blood pudding, right? That goes back to the days of the barbarians and the Vandals and the savages on the British island. But no civilized human being would want to consume blood anyway. So why does the Torah command it? And it's part of this. It's part of this theme that Hashem includes certain commandments that He knows that normal human beings wouldn't even dream of doing anyway, in order to add merit to the Jewish persona. In other words, to allow us to have more mitzvahs, to give us more reward. That's the simple way we understand it, and that's how we could understand many of the mitzvahs that we mentioned in this previous paragraph. But there's another interpretation of the word lizakot that appears in a number of meforshim. Lizakot means to add merit to, but lizakot also means to purify, like, from the word shemen zayit zach, right? Pure oil, pure olive oil. The word zach, or liz, can be put in verb form, lizakot, is to purify. That there are so many commandments in the Torah that are there to refine our personalities. And as we mentioned one time before, the Abarbanel says that one of the things that is the hallmark of the Jewish mishpatim, the civil laws, is that they go above and beyond normal civics. Normal civics require us not to steal, not to murder, but Jewish civics requires us not to speak lashon hara about another person. Jewish civics requires us not to embarrass someone, which in any society, if I embarrass you, can you take me to court? Can you sue me for having caused you embarrassment? That's not an actionable offense in most societies. But in Jewish society, it is an actionable offense. And it's something for which Hashem says a person faces a very severe, at least heavenly penalty for that. So that's one of the added features of even these civic laws. Also, having to do with our agriculture. What other society has set up a structure as defined as this, that takes care of its poor, that creates a welfare state in the way that the Bible does? I mean, it was unheard of, this idea of a welfare state where a certain percentage of your field has to be left for the poor, for gleanings. In the ancient world, this was really such a foreign concept. We take it for granted. Well, of course, the Torah would tell you to take care of the poor. Every community takes care of its poor. Oh, really? That's a 20th century phenomenon. If you were poor in the 19th century, you didn't have much chance of survival. You could sit on the street corner and hope that someone would be benevolent, but there was no mandated requirement to tithe for the poor until very recently in human history. The Bible shows us, this is really an innovation that many of us take for granted. Anyway, let's get back to the rational laws we started, the way we relate to God on an intellectual level. Now, here, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says that there are some aspects of the way that we're meant to relate to Hashem that secular philosophers embrace. When I say secular philosophers, it's very different from secular philosophy that you would think about in the modern world. Philosophers in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time are by and large Muslim philosophers who believe in God, who believe in Allah. The Muslims of his time used Greek philosophy of Aristotle and Plato and transposed them on top of Islamic teachings in the Quran and the Hadith, and came up with a type of Islamic philosophy that really carries forward many of the beliefs of the ancient philosophers. Because as we've talked about many times before, the ancient philosophers believed in a sentient being that controls or supervises the world. But there are many differences between the Greek conception of God and the Jewish conception of God. And this is what got a lot of Muslim philosophers into a lot of trouble. And we'll talk about that as we advance in this book, and we talk about something called the Kalam, which was the attempt that many religious Muslims had to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic teachings about God. And usually they had to compromise on one over the other. And this was the conflict that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi faced. It was the conflict that the Rambam faced, but they approached it in very different ways. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi sees a very, very bold, strong dividing line between the Jewish approach to relating to an almighty being and the Greek philosophical approach to relating to an almighty being. And that's why he sort of bifurcates this idea, that there are certain aspects of our approach, of our relationship with Hashem on an intellectual level, that philosophy embraces as well. That there's a supreme being who supervises the world. We believe in him. We give a certain reverence to him, to that being. But here's where we have to depart from philosophy. And he says, the Torah also includes principles that philosophers do not necessarily accept, such as that Hashem knows the innermost thoughts of people, and certainly their deeds and their conversations, and that he rewards and punishes man for them, and that Einei Hashem mishotetot b'chol haaretz, that God's eyes rove throughout the entire world, which is a quote from Tanakh, from Divrei Hayamim. Why do we differ from philosophy in that respect? Because the one major difference between the Jewish conception of God and the Greek conception of God is the idea of hashgacha, of providence, of God's involvement within our everyday lives. If you go back all the way to the beginning of the Kuzari, back to Essay 1, Paragraph 1, Subparagraph 7, and Subparagraph 8. It's on page 48, the very bottom line of page 48. Do you remember when we started this book, like 87 years ago, we saw that the Khazar king has a dream that is a very disturbing dream. The dream tells him, an angel comes to him in a dream and tells him, your intentions are desirable to the Creator, but not your deeds. And so what does this impel the king to do? He says, I need to go out and find different wise men from different cultures and different religions, and maybe they'll tell me what I'm doing wrong and why this angel is coming to me. So the first person that he seeks guidance from is a philosopher, at least in the narrative of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. We spent a lot of time on this. So the philosopher at this point says, regarding the king's dream, the philosopher explained, God neither desires nor despises. He is above all human desires and intentions. This must be so, for a person who intends to do something is incomplete until he actually does what he intended to do. Only after he fulfills his intentions is he complete. And certainly, since God lacks nothing and is always complete, he cannot desire or intend anything. God is not a volitional being, because anyone who has a desire to do something is somehow lacking until he actually does what he wants to do. That's why Aristotle was so opposed to the conception of creation. He didn't believe that God one day woke up and said, gee, I wish I had a universe that I could create. He says that's such a human characteristic that it is an insult to the perfection of what we believe God is, to even suggest that God woke up one day and said, I think I'll create something from nothing. If nothing was perfectly fine yesterday, why is it not okay today for a perfect God? And if it wasn't okay yesterday, then you were lacking when you didn't have a world. How could God be lacking? That's the philosophical contradiction or paradox that exists within our understanding of Hashem. We leave that paradox unresolved. We acknowledge that it's a paradox because we believe that God is a perfect being, and at the same time acknowledge that at one time he created the universe. It's a paradox. How could God just wake up one day and decide that yesterday it was okay to have zero, and now I need to create a world? Now I need to create a universe. Why did he do it? What impelled him to do it? What volition within God sort of caused him to say, I need to create? And if that need really existed within Hashem, was he lacking before he created it? How can we say that God is lacking anything? So therefore, that led Aristotle to believe that there was never such a thing as creation. And in paragraph number 8, he takes that one to its logical next step. Furthermore, philosophers believe that Hashem, or God, is too elevated to know the details of this world. This is because all events that occur in this world are temporal, and God exists outside of temporality. God then never acquires any new knowledge, and so has no knowledge of you, and certainly does not know about your intentions or actions. Of course, then, God does not hear your prayers or see your movements. And that, of course, is perfectly rational when you think about this supreme perfection of God. Why would God want to waste his time with inquiring about something that's occurring on a specific time if God exists outside of time? Why would he care about such a puny being as myself? These are all of the questions that we ask when we're about to start praying, or we should be thinking about. Like, here I am, I'm about to start Shemona Esrei, and I'm about to start approaching God. And by the way, Hashem, I've got a little bit of a pain in my back today. Could you please take care of that? And when you think about the audacity and the absurdity of that kind of thought in relation to what Hashem really is, you sympathize with the argument of the philosopher, because it seems to be outrageous. And that's what led Aristotle and a whole school of philosophy in the Greek world to believe that. The Muslims inherit these texts it's sometime in the 8th or 9th century, and they are enthralled by these ideas, particularly because it's a very new religion that doesn't have its own structured philosophy or theology, and therefore adopt Greek philosophy and somehow manage to integrate certain aspects of it into Islam. The Rambam does the same in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide for the Perplexed. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is very conflicted about this idea of integrating Greek philosophy into Judaism. The Rambam wasn't as conflicted as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, but the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is very conflicted. And therefore, he makes a very strong dividing line, and he says there are certain things that even philosophers accept about what we believe in regarding Hashem, but we have such a closeness and a belief of the immanence of Hashem despite his transcendence. And therefore, there are certain parts of departure, certain points of departure that he discusses over here. Yes?
So doesn't that, according to that philosophy, Greek philosophy, not counting Judaism, doesn't that make all religion obsolete, really?
Right. Or, yeah, of course. Well, that's, if you go back to the beginning of the Kuzari, you will see that that is precisely what the philosopher told the king. He tells the king, look, I don't know what your dream was all about, but I can tell you this much. It doesn't really matter whether you do this or you do that in your service of God. He doesn't care. God's not looking at what you're doing. God just wants to make sure that you have an intellectual perfection so that you can connect with him through your intellect. It's perfection of intellect that makes you one with this divine being. It's got nothing to do with his desire of you doing a certain behavior one way or the other. God is completely above all of that. And by the way, why did the Khazar king in this narrative reject the philosopher? He says, because my dream tells me otherwise. My experience of the dream has demonstrated to me that the angel told me I'm not doing something that I'm supposed to do. And if you believe that my actions don't make a difference one way or the other, then clearly you're not in sync with my dream. And I believe what my dream tells me more than what your logic tells you. That's the whole point. Yes?
So I was always taught, like, you know, as a Jew, that Hashem is like our father. So there's an emotional connection, like, and the way you truly understand it is when you become a parent. You understand the way you care. You know, you create your child, so to speak, but you care about the child ever since from the beginning of conception, as a mother anyway, and you care, you know, during pregnancy, you know, drink certain things, whatever. So the question is, like, do these philosophers totally dissociate from any sort of emotional connection?
Yes. The answer simply is quite simply yes. They completely disassociate that connection. And of course, your point is very well taken. In Judaism, we believe that the whole structure of parents and spouses was all created by Hashem as to allow us to have a metaphor of how we're supposed to relate to him as a personal, immanent God. But of course, that's lost on the philosopher.
I just wanted to go back for a second. When Linda asked you, should we give charity to non-Jews, and you quoted the Rambam, who says you should, b'nei darchei shalom. That answer always bothered me because I feel like the subtext of that is, really, you don't have to give charity to non-Jews, but we don't want them to hate us and kill us, so to live in peace, we will give them charity. That's what I feel like the, you know, the blurb would say under B'nei darchei shalom. Why wouldn't the answer be, they're human beings, we should help them as well?
That's you phrased the question in a beautiful way. I was going to make a joke and say how modern you are, how liberal you are, but I'm just joking. In other words, realize, when is the Rambam living? When is the Shulchan Aruch being composed? We are constantly persecuted on a daily basis from the very people that we are called upon to support in charity. And therefore there is a natural desire for the Jewish community to completely withdraw from having anything to do with a non-Jewish society. In the Rambam's 12th century and in the Shulchan Aruch's 16th century. And basically in every century up until the middle of the 20th century. So when we look at it, we say, you know, like, come on, these people are human beings as well. Well, we can say that because we have the luxury of living and having peaceful relations with the non-Jews in our world. And so that's the way I've always understood it. It's not a callous statement saying that it would have been better if we didn't have to, but we have to because otherwise they're going to chop our heads off. That's speaking from an orientation of someone who's faced pogroms and persecutions ad infinitum. For us today, it is more than darchei shalom. You're right. It's because we have to be compassionate to every human being, and that's really what we're called upon to do. We have to be a light unto the nations. We have to have some level of integration and connection. Yeah, yes?
It always bothers me. If you go to a museum, you see all people who donated, Jews, and it bothers me. And it's millions and millions. We have so many Jewish needs, the yeshivas, the schools, the community, Israel. Why so? And the truth is, I don't think there is appreciation. Or in the hospital, I understand, but it's so excessive, and this is the focus of some people who...
You're absolutely right, but we can't allow other people's misplaced priorities to distort our priorities. just because they're giving all of their tzedakah money to a foundation for, the welfare of the treatment of animals, right? Or saving the whales or whatever the thing is, doesn't mean, well, look at all the Jewish money that we lost because that guy who's a billionaire gave all of his charity to that secular cause. So therefore, that lets me off the hook of supporting non-Jewish causes. It doesn't work that way. And the truth is, it's not healthy for us. That's reactionary to someone who's doing something in an incorrect way. So what? I'm going to just be as incorrect as he or she is? I don't accept that. And so that's why I said it has to be a certain percentage. When I see a group of kids collecting money for Sick Kids Hospital, I always try to give them something. I'm not talking about huge amounts. There's a young man in our community who does an annual campaign for Sick Kids Hospital. And it's a beautiful thing. That's an Orthodox young boy who wears a yarmulke should get his picture in the paper because he raises tens of thousands of dollars for Sick Kids Hospital. Is there a greater Kiddush Hashem than that? It's beautiful. And we have to remember that as well, that that's part of our role. It doesn't mean that we should, that we have to be at the forefront of every charity that's not Jewish, but we should try to be supportive to a certain degree. Yeah, and with this will be with our last one. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the non-Jewish charities, with regards to investigation, where the money is actually going. Number one, is it actually going to the people who need it? Or could it actually sometimes be a front for supporting anti-Jewish terrorists?
Well, why are you only asking that about non-Jewish charities? You should have to investigate every charity. There are a lot of Jewish charities that a big percentage of the intake goes to clerical or to someone or to some CEO or whatever it is. So that should not be a deterrent necessarily.